And recording has started, so here we go. Remember, we mentioned this a couple of times. It's kind of inherent when I talked about metabolism, but also we talked about it very briefly when I was talking about, what your mitochondria do and, why they are the powerhouse of the cell. Insert meme here. And the reason is that the energy that you need to run your metabolism and do everything, move, eat, breathe, think, all of the things that an organism does, the energy that drives that is energy that's stored in chemical bonds. What's more, the matter that you eat, the physical molecules that you need, all of the amino acids that you need to eat to make new proteins and all of the stuff that you assemble new DNA out of and all that, that ultimately comes from food as well. So when you eat, you're taking in a bunch of complicated molecules, breaking them down. Some of them you're able to extract energy from, and some of them you're able to assemble into new molecules, more of you. So when any living thing eats, we say that both biomass and energy are transferred. Biomass just means living matter, the matter that makes up living things. And so when this adorable panda is eating these adorable bamboo shoots, the panda is taking the large molecules that made up the bamboo, breaking them down, gaining energy from some of those molecules, and reassembling others of those molecules into panda biomass. So the panda is turning plant biomass into panda biomass and getting energy out of it. So we can talk about eating ecologically as the transfer of both energy and the transfer of biomass. Okay. A convenient way to break down what goes on in an ecosystem is to look at biomass and energy transfer taking place between what we call trophic levels. If you go to an ecosystem, you could do this in the nature reserve. Heck, you could do it on your front lawn if you wanted to, but anywhere there's an ecosystem, we can take all of the living things that are generating biomass and energy and call them the primary producers. In all of the ecosystems that you've ever been in, the primary producers do photosynthesis. They are plants and photosynthetic bacteria and photosynthetic protists, seaweeds and green algae and things like that, that ultimately run the game on sunlight. They're able to absorb solar energy and take in small molecules like carbon dioxide and water and use those to build biomass, to build more plant stuff, and to store energy in those molecules. There are some ecosystems where photosynthesis is not, does not drive the primary producers. They tend to be these ecosystems that are a couple of miles down at the bottom of the ocean where there's no light at all, and the energy resource that runs the game is interesting chemical reactions, things going on at places like what we call hydrothermal vent zones in the deepest ocean. So there are some ecosystems where the primary producers are not dependent on light and don't do photosynthesis, but all of the ones that you've ever seen, unless you happen to have taken a joyride on the deep sea submersible Alvin or something like that, all of the ones that you've ever been in, the primary producers generate biomass and energy by harnessing sunlight, photosynthesis. Okay. So the critters that eat the producers are what we call primary consumers. So if we're out in the nature reserve looking over the prairie, the grasses and the goldenrods and the mountain mint and the rattlesnake master and the Rexia wildflowers and the wild blackberry and the black-eyed Susans and the hairy blazing stars. All of those plants would be the primary producers. The primary consumers might be rodents and definitely insects that eat the primary producers, all of the bugs eating the plants. Secondary consumers would feed on the primary consumers. So maybe predatory insects, in some cases, rodents would be the secondary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers, and quaternary consumers, eat the tertiary consumers. So we can talk about kind of a base level of the primary producers, and then everybody else is either eating the producers or eating critters that eat the producers, or eating critters that eat the producers, and so on. The producers are the foundation of the whole thing, and you get several levels of consumers on top of that, and we call those trophic levels. Trophein is the ancient Greek word for to feed. So trophic levels just means feeding levels. Now, this is useful, but it is a bit of a simplification because a lot of organisms could occupy several levels at once. If you were to eat these delicious fajitas, you'd be a primary consumer because you're eating plants, you're eating the corn in the tortilla, and you're eating the peppers and the onions and the lime juice. You'd also be a secondary consumer because you're eating a cow that eats the primary producers. So in just one meal, you might be eating on 2 or more levels. So we are kind of oversimplifying this a bit. And there's also no particular reason why there must be 4 levels of consumers. There are ecosystems that might only have producers and primary consumers, and that's it. On the other hand, in parts of the ocean, the local ecosystem might have as many as 9 levels of consumers. So there is no particular reason why real world ecosystems have to have exactly 4. There may be more, there may be fewer, it all depends. So there's a diagram showing typical organisms on trophic levels in a prairie on the left and an ocean on the right. In a prairie, the plants, of course, are the primary producers. The grasshoppers would be the primary consumers eating the plants. For secondary consumers, we've got a rodent eating one of the grasshoppers. For tertiary consumers, we've got a rattlesnake eating the rodent that ate the grasshopper that ate the plants. And then quaternary consumers, what we've got is a red-tailed hawk. I haven't seen rattlesnakes in the nature reserve, but I have seen red-tailed hawks in the neighborhood. So all of these are organisms that you could find practically in your backyard. And then in the ocean, the primary producers are what we call phytoplankton. Plankton does not mean the weird thing that looks like an Adderall pill that owns the Krusty Krab. Plankton is any organism that floats but doesn't swim, or at least doesn't swim well enough that it can control its position in the water. Plankton is any organism that goes with the flow. Phytoplankton would be floating algae and bacteria that are photosynthetic. They're eaten by zooplankton, which is animal-like plankton. So heterotrophic protists and tiny crustaceans and baby fish and things like that. The secondary consumers in this diagram might be fish like mackerel that eat the primary consumers. The tertiary consumers would be, that's a tuna right there that's eating the mackerel. And up at the top of the trophic chain or the food chain, if you like. That's an orca, which eats pretty much anything it wants to. And I'll mention that the highest level consumers are what we call apex predators. So the orca is an apex predator in the ocean because nothing eats orcas. There's nothing that preys on orcas, I guess, except for people when we catch them and, put them at SeaWorld and make them do tricks or some crap like that. But us aside, orcas are the apex predators of their parts of the ocean. They're predators, and there's nothing that eats them. They've got no natural enemies. The same would be true for red-tailed hawks on the prairie. Nothing's going to eat a red-tailed hawk. Now, here's the thing. Imagine you could, I'll talk about the nature reserve prairie again. You couldn't really do this, but imagine that you could magically uproot every plant and put every one of them on a scale. You could measure the amount of biomass that's present among the primary producers in the nature reserve ecosystem. So we could measure the amount of plant biomass, and imagine we represent that as a bar. Imagine we could now vacuum up every primary consumer, every little plant-eating insect in the nature reserve, and weigh them. We'd represent that as a bar, and we'd find that there's a lot less biomass of primary consumers than there is of primary producers. There's a lot more weight of primary consumers than there is of primary producers than there is of primary consumers. And as we went up the chain, we'd find that the higher we get in this food chain or trophic web, the smaller the amount of biomass. So there might be, I don't know, let's say we have 100,000 pounds of plant material in the prairie part of the reserve. That might support about 10,000 pounds worth of insects, which might be enough to support 1,000 pounds of little rodents, which might be enough to support 100 pounds worth of snake, which might be enough to support 10 pounds of red-tailed hawk, which I think is maybe like one pair of hawks or something like that. And so if you take these bars and you stack them one on top of the other, you get a diagram that we call a trophic pyramid, because a pyramid gets narrower the closer you get to the top. There's less biomass the higher up you go. And the reason for this is, first of all, that at every trophic level, you lose energy and biomass. Think about the food you eat. Your metabolism is not absolutely 100% efficient. You don't get anywhere close to extracting 100% of the possible energy and biomass that you could extract, in theory, out of your food. You get something like 30% if memory serves. Don't quote me on that. I could have that number wrong, but it's close. It's just not possible to make metabolism that's 100% efficient. So you don't get 100% of the energy that's in your food. Some of that biomass you don't digest, and you lose that as waste. In your case, in particular, dietary fiber just refers to indigestible parts of your plant food because your body can't break down cellulose that makes up plant cell walls. So any dietary fiber that you eat in your plants ends up getting excreted. And then a lot of the energy that you get from your food goes to keep your body warm, and ultimately that just gets radiated out to space, or it's just used to maintain what you've got instead of going to new growth. And what we call the ecological efficiency of each trophic level is the fraction of biomass at a lower level that ends up permanently on a higher level, and it averages about 10%. In other words, it would take you roughly 1,000 pounds of food to grow a 100-pound person. It takes very roughly 5,000 pounds of feed to raise a 500-pound hog. In real life, it can vary quite a bit. For hogs, I think it's a bit more. It's closer to 15%. Cows, it's something like 8%. So it can be more or it can be less, but 10% is a workable rule of thumb. The biomass available at each trophic level is only going to be about 10% of what it is at the next lower level, because only about 10% of the biomass and energy at a lower level permanently ends up part of the next level. Which is why it's very easy to find plants and bugs if you go outside, and less easy to find rodents and snakes. And you have to be pretty lucky to spot red-tailed hawks on any given day. There just aren't as many red-tailed hawks as there are insects, and this is why. So there we've got a diagram of what one would look like in the ocean. It might take 1 million kilograms of little floating algae to support 100,000 kilograms of little shrimpies and baby fish and things like that, the zooplankton, which might be enough to feed 10,000 kilograms of shrimp, which might be enough food for 1,000 kilograms of largish fish, which might be enough to sustain 100-kilogram shark. So that's the rule of thumb. Each level of your trophic pyramid is about 1/10 the size of the level below. And that leads to a phenomenon that we call biological magnification. And this is important. This directly impinges on your own health. There's a number of things, of substances, that living things can't break down and can't easily excrete. And that means that they just tend to stick around in living tissues and build up. And one of them is a pesticide, an insect killing chemical called DDT. Diphenol, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, DDT. Used to be very commonly used. Your grandparents might be able to remember spray trucks coming through neighborhoods on summer's days that were trying to wipe out mosquitoes by just spraying DDT right into the air. They were doing that back in the 50s. You might have old relatives that can remember the DDT trucks. There's two reasons why we don't use DDT anymore. One of them we talked about way back when I was talking about natural selection. And that is, if you spray a lot of DDT, you might kill 99% of the bugs, but the 1% that survive will be the ones that have natural resistance, and they'll breed and make more like them. So part of the reason why we don't use it is resistance. The other part of the reason is that DDT, once you spray it, it doesn't disappear, it sticks around. It ultimately washes into local streams and lakes and ponds and rivers. So DDT in water, if you look down at the lower left, we measure in parts per million right here. You know, a percent is 1 part in 100. A part per million works out to being 1/10,000th of 1%. It's a tiny amount. And the DDT in water at the time when it was being sprayed might be, oh, good grief, I always have to count decimals. 3 millionths of a part per million. 3/millionths of 1/10,000th of 1%. That's an absolutely teensy amount. And you would think it would have no effect at all. But here's what happens. It gets absorbed by the phytoplankton, the little algae. And then if you look at the zooplankton, the little shrimpies and baby fish and things that are eating the algae, every little shrimp, every little, shrimp-like critter that you might have seen in the pond water lab way back when, has to eat thousands of little algae in order to survive. And when these little shrimpy things digest that algae, the DDT doesn't go anywhere. It stays in the bodies. The shrimp can't excrete it, and they can't break it down. They can't metabolize it. So the level of DDT is actually maybe a couple thousand times greater, because each little shrimp is having to eat many thousands of little algae. So we've gone from 3/millionths of a part per million to 400ths of a part per million in the zooplankton. And then the zooplankton gets eaten by small fish, and every small fish has to eat dozens of zooplankton in order to live. And the DDT doesn't go anywhere. It's not excreted. It stays in the body. So the level in small fish is now half of a part per million. And every large fish has to eat multiple small fish. And the DDT in large fish is 2 parts per million. And then when you look at fish-eating birds, notably bald eagles and ospreys, the DDT level in fish-eating birds has gone up to 25 parts per million. So that's an increase in DDT concentration of 10 million times as you go from the phytoplankton at the base of things to the eagles and ospreys at the top. And the reason that matters is 25 parts per million still doesn't sound like a lot, but it has this effect on birds. It disrupts their ability to make eggshells. It disrupts their ability to metabolize the calcium that they need for eggshells. And bird populations were dying off because birds were laying eggs with such weakened shells that they would shatter as soon as they came out of mama bird. This is a major reason why the bald eagle, until fairly recently, was endangered in every state except for Alaska. They have made a remarkable recovery since the 1990s. Some years they nest in Lake Conway, and I've seen them up in the Ozarks. So they're doing much better than they were. And I think they're no longer on the endangered species list. But this is a big part of why they almost got wiped out. Our national bird, our national symbol, almost got destroyed by DDT and this phenomenon of biological magnification. And it just naturally follows from the way that trophic pyramids work. There's another one that builds up at high levels, and that's mercury. And you do get mercury in seawater. Some of that is actually a waste product produced by burning coal, but some of it is there naturally. It's not all human pollution. But the same thing happens. Every little microscopic green protist or bacterium in the ocean picks up a teensy amount of mercury, but every little shrimp eats thousands of little algae, and every small fish eats thousands of little shrimp, and every bigger fish eats hundreds of small fish, and every even bigger fish eats hundreds of those. And what you're looking at here is a tuna. You might know tunas only as these things that come in cans, but tunas are very high-level predators. Tunas are streamlined fish. They're built for speed. The really big ones, like this blue tuna here, are, I don't know if they're absolutely top level, but they're very high up. And so the problem that's been noted is that fish that are high on the trophic pyramid, high level consumers, build up high enough levels of mercury that the US government is currently advising pregnant and nursing women and young children not to eat shark, not to eat swordfish, and limit their consumption of tuna. The reason this is important is that mercury is toxic, and it's especially toxic to developing brains. Doses of mercury that wouldn't particularly hurt me because my brain is pretty much done developing. Sorry, that sound you heard was a bunch of former students saying, yep, sure is. Would potentially cause lifelong deficits in children that were exposed to them. That's why, you know, mercury is especially dangerous to them. So that's why pregnant women and children are recommended not to eat these fish, and the same for nursing women. You know, if you think about it, a baby nursing from mama is the highest level consumer of all. So that's why this sort of thing sometimes matters. Well, it all matters, but that's why it might matter to you, even if you're not biologists, even if you're just, you know, trying to eat healthy and keep your family safe. And I'll add that the story does not even end there. That's actually a picture that I took in the nature reserve. That is, of course, a tree stump. Duh. You can see a bunch of dead leaves surrounding it, and those will eventually get broken down by fungi. And the dead wood in the stump will also get broken down because you can see those striped things right there, which you can find on just about any wood around here, as long as it hasn't been treated and as long as it's been outside for a while. Those stripy things right there are just the fruiting bodies, or the sporocarps, if you remember those, of fungi. And remember that the sporocarps are reproductive structures, but where the fungus is actually doing its work is it's growing through this wood as a set of filaments that are literally digesting their way through this wood, penetrating into it, breaking it down, making it start to get crumbly. You know, if you've ever handled rotten wood, you notice that it gets very weak and very easy to crumble. And given enough time, these fungi will destroy the tree stump completely. It will just all crumble, and the little crumbly bits will end up as part of the soil. And ultimately, the atoms that made up that tree will get recycled. The decomposers, like the fungi and bacteria in the soil, break down dead organisms and eventually ensure that the atoms that made up the dead go back to nourishing the living. You know, every atom of carbon in your body has been part of countless other organisms that lived and died and rotted, and ultimately their atoms went on to somebody else. Nothing's ever really lost. Wow, I feel like Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars sequels. No one's ever really gone. There we go. All right. Sorry, Mark Hamill, if you ever hear this. So now we can talk about something that goes on in ecosystems called nutrient cycling. And that is simply the way that, well, atoms get recycled over and over and over again in ecosystems. And we'll start by talking about the carbon cycle, the C in schnapps. What drives it is the fact that living things can carry out photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide gas, just one atom of carbon with two hydrogens stuck to it, and pulls it out of the atmosphere. And we call this, by the way, carbon fixation. When you take carbon that is in the form of carbon dioxide, this gas, this very small molecule, and start sticking the carbon atoms together and turn them into more complex compounds like sugars, we call that fixing carbon. And plants and algae and photosynthetic bacteria are able to do this thanks to some absolutely beautiful chemistry that I just haven't got time to get into this go around. So that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. What puts it back in is respiration. When you eat, you break down the plant material or whatever it is that you've got that's on your plate. You break that down, you extract energy from those molecules, and the ultimate waste product of that energy extraction process is carbon dioxide gas, which you get rid of as a waste product. In your case, you breathe it out. The gas that you breathe out contains much more carbon dioxide than the gas that you breathed in. And so the major driving forces are photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, respiration puts it back in, and these two processes globally are more or less balanced. There's some more wrinkles to that. There's more than just photosynthesis and respiration. Fire puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If you burn anything, it puts CO2 in. Some new CO2 gets added whenever a volcano erupts. The gas that comes out of a volcano is carbon dioxide, some other things as well, like sulfur dioxide and things like that. That puts new carbon dioxide in. And carbon dioxide can also be taken out by non-living processes. The big one is if certain silicate minerals weather, right? If you have a mountain made of a certain type of rock, as that mountain very slowly erodes, the rock that makes it up will slowly break down. And as part of the breakdown process, it will absorb CO2. So there's more than just photosynthesis and respiration, but those are the two big driving forces. And since I've talked about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, I'm going to digress for a minute to talk about global climate. It's not a hoax the Chinese invented, folks. And here's the way this works. Whenever you take radiant energy, light, and you shine it on something, it passes through space and it hits that something and it ultimately warms it up. So the sun shines and light comes from the sun. So do other forms of radiant energy like X-rays and such. And eventually some of that light starts passing through the Earth's atmosphere. That energy mostly goes straight through the atmosphere without getting absorbed. If the atmosphere did absorb all of that energy, the atmosphere would be opaque and it would be pitch dark on the surface of the Earth, because all of the sun's energy would get absorbed before it reached the surface. But most of the light from the sun goes right through the atmosphere and lands on the surface of the Earth and lights everything up, and that's how you can see. One exception that I'll mention is that high up in the atmosphere, in a layer called the lower stratosphere, between 12 and 19 miles above the surface, that's higher than airplanes fly. In that layer, we happen to have a zone of a form of oxygen called ozone. That's 3 oxygen atoms stuck together in a little triangle. That's ozone. Ozone close to the surface is a pollutant. If you've ever been around like high voltage electrical equipment and you've noticed a kind of metallic smell, this kind of tang in the air, you're smelling ozone. And close to the surface, it's actually bad for you. It can, attack your nasal passages and things like that. Way up in the lower stratosphere, the ozone absorbs over 97% of the medium frequency ultraviolet light that the sun sends out. And that layer does actually heat up. The air up there actually gets warmer. If it wasn't for the ozone layer, a lot more ultraviolet light would reach the surface. And you don't want that because ultraviolet light is very good at damaging DNA. And really bright ultraviolet light will just kill a cell. Ultraviolet light that's not quite bright enough to kill can still cause mutations. And you might remember that, if you expose yourself to too much ultraviolet light, you increase the chances of a mutation knocking out oncogenes and turning your skin cells into cancer cells, making them no longer able to regulate growth and division anymore. Notice how, by the way, I'm taking ideas and concepts that we've talked about sometimes weeks earlier and bringing them back together. This is the way the final is going to work, because the final is cumulative. And to really get the most out of this course, you've got to be able to put puzzle pieces together. Sometimes the puzzle pieces, sometimes you might have forgotten about some of the pieces, but now would be a really good time to start reviewing them. So anyway, with the exception of ozone absorbing the sun's medium frequency ultraviolet light, most of the radiant energy that the sun puts out goes right through the atmosphere and hits the surface of the earth. Now, when all of that light hits the surface of the earth, that light energy can't go anywhere, because a basic principle of physics is that energy is never created or destroyed, it's just transformed. So as that light hits the earth, it starts warming the earth up. And if you don't believe me, walk across a parking lot on a summer day barefoot, like I used to do as a little kid going to the swimming pool when I didn't feel like putting on my sandals. And you will rapidly notice that the earth is capable of heating up quite a bit. Different types of surface heat up more than others. Parking lots heat up an awful lot. Grass doesn't heat up nearly as much. So some surfaces absorb lots of energy and get hot, and other surfaces reflect a lot of that energy and stay cool. But all of the earth heats up to some degree when all of that light and UV and other forms of energy hit it. The earth gets warm. Now, another principle of physics is that anything in the universe that is not at the coldest possible temperature, anything in the universe that is not absolute zero, gives off energy. You're giving off energy as you sit there. You're giving off energy in the form of infrared radiation, which your eyes can't see, but night vision goggles can see. They're sensitive to the radiation that you're giving off now, and that's how it's possible to use them to see people in the dark. And that's true of anything that is warmer than absolute zero temperature. It gives off energy. And as the earth warms up, it re-radiates energy. It gives it back. And the atmosphere is very good at absorbing the infrared radiation that the earth gives off. I found this out once when I was hanging out in the Mojave Desert. I was actually not too far from a little town called Amboy, which almost doesn't exist now, but you might have seen it because it was one of the places that the Pixar animators visited when they were designing Radiator Springs, right? From the Cars movies. You've seen Cars. It's like Lightning McQueen and Larry the Cable Guy playing Mater the tow truck and all of that, right? And there's Cars and, okay. This was a movie. You might have heard of them. We used to go to theaters and see them. Anyway, a lot of that action takes place in this weird little desert town called Radiator Springs. And when the Pixar animators went looking for real world landscapes to base Radiator Springs on, one of the places that they visited was Amboy, California. And so I'm camping in the desert about 10 miles away from Amboy. I did not encounter Mater or lightning or anybody. And I had the bright idea to camp on some nice sand that's that's close to some rocks. Well, guess what? The rocks had been soaking up the sunlight all day. And so when the sun finally set, the rocks were really hot. You know, it's not too uncommon out there to not be able to sit down because you'll get a burn even through your jeans if you sit down on some of these hot rocks. I've been out there when you probably could have fried an egg on the rocks. And the problem was I nestled down in my sleeping bag and tried to get some sleep. And those rocks were still giving off heat energy in the form of infrared. And that was heating the air all around me. So I basically was trying to sleep in the world's biggest damn convection oven. And it was pretty miserable until the rocks finally cooled down after midnight. So that's when I learned directly that sunlight travels through space and through the atmosphere and hits the solid Earth. As the Earth heats up, the Earth starts giving off energy. And the energy that the Earth gives off heats the atmosphere. The atmosphere is very good at absorbing the infrared radiation that the Earth gives off. The parts of the atmosphere that are especially good at absorbing the radiation that the Earth gives off are gases like water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane, otherwise known as natural gas. The stuff that comes out of your gas stove is nearly pure methane. So yeah, if you don't feel like going out to Radiator Springs, California, and camping in the desert on a hot day, you can see this closer to home if you look at birds soaring on a nice summer day. You'll see birds like vultures going around and around in circles. Sometimes a whole flock of them will just be circling and circling. What they're doing is surfing on a pillar of hot rising air called a thermal. What's going on is that the sun is shining on the Earth. A patch of the Earth is warming up. As that warms up, it gives off energy and heats the atmosphere. And when you heat hot air, it rises. So what's going on here is there's an invisible column of hot air that's rising. And as it rises, these birds can ride it up like they're riding an elevator. Instead of having to flap to stay in the air, they can just hold their wings out and they can just glide. Now, gliders always sink relative to the air, but these birds are sinking, but they're sinking more slowly than the air is rising. So they're able to hold position in the air without doing any flapping and can hang out there for hours until they finally spot some nice tasty roadkill or something like that. So that's a way in which around here, maybe not this time of year, but certainly in summer, you can see the effects of the Earth being warmed by the sun and then the Earth giving off radiation that warms the atmosphere. You know, these birds are soaring because they're soaring in a patch of warm rising air. So the atmosphere acts like a blanket that tends to trap heat close to the surface. So the Earth is kept warm by the sun, but it's also kept warm by what we call re-radiation. The atmosphere absorbing heat from the Earth, warming up, and then giving off heat back to the Earth, kind of like a blanket works. Blankets, unless they're electric blankets, blankets don't directly heat you. but they take your body heat and they keep it close to you instead of it just going off into space. The atmosphere works the same way. And the carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere is especially good at absorbing that radiant energy from the warmed Earth. And then as it heats up, it gives off energy back to the Earth and keeps everything warm. This is not exactly the way that greenhouses work. This is what we call the greenhouse effect. For the record, this is something to tell your drunkle at Thanksgiving if you have to. The basic way that this works out was worked out in 1896 by this guy, a Nobel Prize winning Swedish chemist by the name of Svante Arrhenius, who also developed the concept of activation energy, which you might remember from when we talked about enzymes. Oh, look, there's another callback to things we covered earlier. So the basic way that this works out had been understood for over 120 some years. The greenhouse effect is not remotely controversial. We've understood it pretty well. Okay, how does this tie into the carbon cycle? I was going on about carbon cycling, and then I started going on and on about radiation and all that. 1958, a guy named Charles David Keeling sets up shop on the top of a mountain on the big island of Hawaii, the mountain of Mauna Loa. And he starts taking measurements of the concentration of carbon dioxide gas. Why there, Mauna Loa has very pure air. It's not close to any major pollution source. It's very high. It's almost 14,000 feet up, but it's also, you can drive up to the top. It's accessible. And global weather patterns tend to mix the atmosphere pretty well. So if you want to find a place where you can estimate what the entire atmosphere is doing, Mauna Loa is a good place to make measurements. Or at least if you want to measure what the atmosphere is doing in the northern hemisphere. He later set up some other bases in the southern hemisphere. We don't need to worry about those. But Mauna Loa is a good place to get a feel for what the whole atmosphere is doing. And he found that there's a measurable annual cycle of carbon dioxide levels. In January of any given year, carbon dioxide levels are rising, and they'll rise up until about May. What's going on in May? Well, that's the time that spring has come. And in the northern hemisphere, especially in the northern part of it, in Canada and Siberia and the northern US, there are still enormous tracts of forest. Siberia, the part that isn't tundra, is just forest as far as the eye can see. There's a whole ocean of trees out there. And in spring and summer, when Siberia and Canada warm up, all of those forests start growing, and they all begin growing leaves. And for trees to grow, what they have to do is suck up carbon dioxide and do photosynthesis and fix that carbon dioxide to make it into new biomass, to make it into leaf. And that's enough that by May, the rise of global carbon dioxide stops and it measurably drops. And the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere go down until you hit about September and October. Well, what happens then? Well, it starts getting cold, and trees stop making new biomass and they shut down for the winter. And then all of those leaves fall and they decay. And when things rot, decomposers ultimately return most of that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And so carbon dioxide levels rise from about September all the way across the new year, all the way up to about May again. So yeah, we have this seasonal cycle with the northern forests acting like this enormous pair of lungs, breathing in and out once a year. So that's what the carbon cycle looks like on a really global scale. Here's the problem. On top of that annual cycle, what Keeling observed was that there's a longer term rise in carbon dioxide concentrations. That's what the cycle would look like over here if carbon dioxide was holding steady. But in fact, what we're getting is carbon dioxide levels rising a bit from year to year. And since 1958, we've gone from, this is parts per million, we've gone from about 320 parts per million to about 420 parts per million. That doesn't sound like a lot. There's not a huge amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but what there is makes the atmosphere more efficient at trapping heat. And this causes average global temperatures to rise. And the first warning of that was the Presidential Scientific Advisory Board warning President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. We've known about this for longer than I've been alive. We're, what, 57 years that we have known of the consequences of increasing global temperatures. Again, this is not remotely controversial. I don't care what they're saying on YouTube. We've known about this for a long time. It's been pretty damn well studied. And the reason it's happening is when you burn coal or oil or natural gas, those things are quite literally fossil fuels. Remember, a fossil is any trace of an organism that used to live and now does not. And at certain times and places in the past history of the Earth, when you've had lots of living things, they've lived, they've died, they've gotten buried, and you can have these huge deposits of formerly living organisms that get buried and compressed and converted into coal, oil, and gas. So the death and the burial of once living organs takes carbon dioxide permanently out of the cycle, or not quite permanently. It takes it out until people start digging up coal, oil, and natural gas and burning them again. We're taking carbon dioxide that was in the carbon cycle 330 million years ago, and we're putting it back into circulation. If anybody doubts my word, it's a shame you can't do this anymore, but I did this about 20 years ago. There used to be active coal mines in Western Arkansas around towns like Clarksville, Scranton, Coal Hill, you know, around about exit 58 on Interstate 40, if you've ever driven west of here about an hour. And they were pits where, you know, you had dozers that were digging up the coal. And what I did was I went and found some of the rocks that were being scraped away from the coal deposits. And if you break those open, you'd find absolutely tons of plant fossils, remains of ancient plants. We had lots of them down there. I've done the same thing in Alabama. Anywhere you get coal, it's associated with the fossils of ancient plants. And what that coal literally is, and the same for petroleum and natural gas, is the remains of living things that used to live and died, and instead of getting eaten, got buried and have been locked out of the carbon cycle for many millions of years. And now that we're digging it up and burning it, we're just putting the CO2 back into circulation. You know, like finding a stash of gold coins in the attic that your grandma put up there in the 1700s or something. That's wealth that's been out of circulation, and you can put it back in. We're doing the same thing with CO2. Now, here's the thing. By itself, the greenhouse effect is wondrously beneficial. If we didn't have it, if you think about it, the moon is almost exactly the same distance from the sun as the Earth is. And the moon's average surface temperature is 153 degrees below 0 Celsius. Okay, the moon is really, really cold. And the reason it's really cold is that the moon is like the bear's den. The bar across the street, the bear's den. The moon is like the bear's den because neither one has any atmosphere. Get it? No atmosphere. Okay, right. That was a joke. Anyhow, it is because we've got greenhouse gases in our atmosphere that the Earth is not a ball of ice. In fact, 600 odd million years ago, probably for reasons having to do with for reasons, I'm not going to get into the reasons. It's a long story. But for reasons, a lot of the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere seems to have gotten scrubbed out, and the Earth went into an ice age that had glaciers almost all the way to the equator, a time period that we call snowball Earth. This, by the way, is not the ice age with the scrats and the mammoths and Sid the stupid sloth. That was much later. This was before we had any life on land. But that was a time when the Earth didn't have as much greenhouse gas in it as it does now, and it froze as solid as Hoth, the ice planet in Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. So if we had no greenhouse effect, life wouldn't be possible. You need some greenhouse gases to make the Earth habitable. There have been times when we've had more, and the Earth has been a lot warmer, and life has gotten through it just fine. The current rise of greenhouse gases in the Earth is not going to destroy all life. Life has been through a hell of a lot worse. It is going to screw us pretty badly because rising global temperatures means things like coastal flooding, more intense storms, much less predictable climates, not so much global warming as global weirding. And that's going to be really bad for our own species. And, that might be something we ought to do something about, although I don't really like our own species all that much anyway. So, whatever. But that's what's going on here. Global climate is a really complicated machine. And, if you have a very complicated machine like your car and you just kind of start messing with parts at random, you may not be able to predict exactly what's going to happen. We're only now getting to the point where we can really understand the complexity of that machine. So global warming is a bit of a misnomer. My preferred term is global weirding. Weather patterns are getting more extreme, and they're also getting less predictable. That was the view from my front porch this past February. This is where I live, and I'm sure you all remember how we got that crazy snowstorm and ice storm in the middle of February, and we got through it, but Texas lost power and Ted Cruz went to Cancun and whatever. Everybody remembers that. This is not a refutation of global warming, because global warming doesn't mean that every spot on the planet is always going to get warmer than normal. But it does mean that fancy system of feedback regulations that determines global climate is getting weird, and it's getting harder to predict. And that extra energy that's present in the atmosphere is doing stuff that we can't predict, can't fully understand, and is going to make for a lowered quality of life for everybody over the next few decades. Hopefully I'll be dead before it gets really bad. Sucks to be you. Right. Okay, in the time we've got, let me mention a couple of other cycles. This is one my kid is learning in 5th grade right now, which he had previously learned in kindergarten. So you've probably heard of this before. It's the hydrologic cycle. Solar energy makes water evaporate from oceans. So water goes from the oceans into the atmosphere. And then when there's a lot of it, it starts forming drops and it falls out of the atmosphere in the form of rain or snow or hail, etc. And eventually it goes back to the oceans, either by rain falling right into the ocean or falling on the land and flowing back to the ocean in the form of rivers. Just like carbon can leave the carbon cycle for a while if it gets locked up in the bodies of living things that are buried, water can leave the active cycle for a while if it freezes and falls in a place where it stays permanently frozen, like the polar ice caps or glaciers in the mountains, or if it soaks into the ground into layers of rock that can soak water up, known as aquifers, and becomes groundwater, which might stay underground for thousands of years before eventually coming back via springs or seeps, little wet patches of ground, things like that. But that's a picture of a rainstorm over the Pacific Ocean, and that captures the hydrologic cycle in one photo. Sunlight shines on the ocean. Water, as the ocean warms, water evaporates. Water goes into the atmosphere in the form of gas. When there's enough in the atmosphere, it starts coming together and making little drops that make clouds. And then in the distance way back here, that's rain falling out of a cloud back into the ocean. So we've got the entire cycle right there. Water go up, water go down. Okay, the next one's the nitrogen cycle, and that's going to take me more than 2 minutes to explain, and we've only got 2 minutes to go. So I'm sorry this one has been a little short. I feel like I'm cheating you of your hard-earned dollars, so I'll try to make the next one longer. But this is a good place for me to end this. So by the power vested in me by the state of Arkansas, I will stop recording.